Hello and welcome to the very first Student for Sensible Drug Policy Reading Group podcast. My name is Jess Bradley and I'm the chair of SSDP UK, and I'm joined today by Melissa Bowen.
Hi.
I guess our podcasts are going to work pretty much like any other reading group really. Every fortnight or so we'll get together, having read a text or watched a documentary about some aspects of drug law reform, and discuss what we find interesting. We'll try and include copies of the text in the comments so you can read them too. And please feel free to get involved. Post your thoughts, comments and suggestions for reading material in the comments.
Okay, so the first topic that we're doing for our very first podcast, we thought we'd go right back to basics and actually consider the very concept of what actually is a drug and how the drug problem is framed. So the two papers that we're looking at to do that, the first one is by Christopher Hallam and Dave Bewley-Taylor. It's called Drug Use, Knowledge, Culture and Context, and it's written for the Beckley Foundation Drug Policy Programme. This drug policy programme is an initiative and it's dedicated to sort of reviewing the effectiveness of national and international drug policies. They also work alongside the International Drug Policy Consortium because they want to promote like effectiveness and direction and look at the content of sort of drug policies. So really this paper kind of criticises the current prohibitionist drug international policy that we've got, and it's just basically highlighting the issues and the problems involved in that. The second paper that we're actually going to look at is by Kenneth Tupper, and it's actually his PhD thesis. We're just looking at one chapter of it though. We're looking at chapter 4 called Discourses and the Drug War Paradigm. Basically his actual PhD thesis is quite interesting because it's on the drug ayahuasca, which is used a lot by indigenous people, indigenous tribes generally, and he wants to consider the benefits of this substance as a plant teacher within an educational context, in like a westernised sort of educational context. But in order to sort of consider this, he has to look at the constraints placed upon this notion by the prohibitionist regime really. So he looks at the construction of drug discourses and how the drugs problem and how our drug war paradigm, as he calls it, is sort of framed. So we're going to consider that as well. But our first paper we're going to consider will be the Beckley Foundation one, entitled Drug Use, Knowledge, Culture and Context. So if you want to make the first point, Jess?
Yeah, so basically for me, the Beckley paper really, it sets up by talking about how the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, which is basically the highest policy makers in the world really, how they talk about drug use, and of course being a national international agency, they collect statistics, they collect information and knowledge about drugs, and it talks about what knowledge that they collect and the way in which they do that. And the paper talks about pretty much how they only really take into account things like statistics of drug use, death. Yeah. That sort of thing. They've
very much got a very sort of quantitative sort of approach to how they sort of view our policies and how they want to.
It's all about numbers, isn't it?
It's all about statistics, numbers. There's no sort of cultural context, is there? That's the.
Yeah. No one's really talking about the reasons why people do drugs. It's all very trying to be objective and scientific. And I think one of the things that the Beckley Foundation paper really draws out is actually because drug use is a human problem, it's not necessarily this objective scientific framework is not necessarily the most appropriate for considering information about drugs, even though obviously statistics about drug use is can be useful. It needs something extra with it. It needs that discussion about context behind it.
It needs a sort of cultural context. You need to look at sort of human questions of meaning, of like why people all over the world take drugs, sort of thing. That's what states need to be informed on, because at the moment all they're getting is just very abstract sort of, they're just getting statistics, they're just getting numbers, they're not getting the true issue. They can't truly ever understand how the problem's framed if all they're getting is these sort of numbers and facts and figures. So I
think a lot of it comes down to the language that we use and how that actually shapes the debate around drugs, particularly on how, like, for most people, drug laws are seen as being pretty natural. Like, people see it as a common sense thing that drugs are prohibited because they're harmful. And that's seen as a natural thing that's pretty much innate, like how you would imagine laws against murder, for example.
We've kind of constructed this problem, haven't we? And I think really the point that sort of the authors make here is that the language we actually use always sort of shapes the way we think about and respond to a problem, I suppose. So the discourse that we've used in relation to drugs, there's no actual natural pharmacological category of licit and illicit substances. That's something that we created ourselves. Like, drugs are actually an evaluative concept. They're not a natural descriptive concept. There are no, as Derrida, famous sort of rhetoric of drugs interview, he said, there are no drugs in nature. Just doesn't exist. It's something that we've invented, but we take it so for granted that this is a natural concept and it's always been there.
Yeah, and I think for me a good case study of that would be how we view, say, even the phrase alcohol and drugs. Like, for all intents and purposes, depending on which definition of drug you're using, alcohol is a drug.
Of course,
we use the term alcohol and drugs because actually drugs has more than one meaning. I think this is an issue which the Ken Tucker paper draws in on, is the different meanings of the words for drugs. And we have alcohol, which is okay because it's legal, and drugs which are not okay.
He's sort of classified it into 3 different categories, hasn't he, Kenneth Tucker? He sort of said you've got your non-drugs, which are your sort of legally regulated drugs. That's your sort of alcohol, tobacco, those kind of drugs. You've got your medicines, so they're a completely different drug category altogether. They're supposed to heal you, all the rest of it. Pharmacological comes in so heavily invested in them. And then you've got your 3rd category, which is just drugs. The bad sort of category. How it's sort of perceived anyway.
Yeah, and I think what the Beckley Foundation paper really talks about is how naming and the way that we define words really reflects how they've been shaped by the power relations going on. How these concepts that we use actually reflect dominant discourse on a subject. I think he used an example of the Falkland Islands.
Yeah, it's a good example, this one.
For all intents and purposes, the Falkland Islands is just a rock in the middle of the ocean near Argentina. But for some people it's the Falkland Islands, and for some people it's Las Maldivas, which is, Argentinian, and the Falklands, which is British. And the fact that the rest of the world considers it to be the Falklands is simply because we've won the war, or the British have won the war, and it's very much shaped by the power and politics. And that's pretty much how it is with other definitions. Say, for example, drugs. The fact that we're in a drug war means that it shapes the way that we think about drugs and the way that we talk about drugs.
And to use another sort of example here, he uses the definition of cannabis to sort of go along with this, because we sort of see the definition of cannabis as this Class B, a legal drug, all the rest of it, rather than you could look at it within another context. Look at how the Rastafarian religion, for instance, would think about cannabis. They would think of it as this sacramental sort of herb, if you like, that appears within their religion. So it's so important, sacramental and fundamental to them, whereas for all intents and purposes, cannabis is generally just seen as this Class B illegal substance. So it's kind of the power relations and the political sort of ideologies that have been able to frame this problem and frame how we look at it.
I think the way that we talk about drugs as being shaped by politicians means that actually the way that we talk about drugs is actually quite constraining, really, isn't it? When people talk about drugs, they generally talk about the bad aspects of drugs. And when people talk about drug experiences, no one ever really goes, oh, I had I don't know, on soaps and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
You don't get people having a nice time.
Or whatever. You'll get people dying off and I won't go into it. Basically, it's quite unrealistic, but they'll always look at the very, very worst case scenario, and they'll always look at the most negative connotations whenever you're considering like drugs or drug policy, all that kind of stuff. And the actual Beckley paper, the Drug Use Knowledge Culture Context, highlights this quite well, because it actually where am I?
Are you thinking about drug metaphors?
No, I'm not thinking about drug metaphors. I'm actually thinking about how, like, most texts on drugs, like, a large part of this sort of analysis is always devoted to the personal problems, crime, overdose, addiction, health problems. It's never ever devoted to pleasures, the possible benefits that you can derive from substances. That's completely absent from the discourse. It's just not there at all. And they use an example here, which I think is quite interesting. And they use about the history of the motor car. I mean, the history of the motor car, it's written, the vast majority of, say, histories of motor cars or wherever, they're always written without so much sort of reference to all the accidents and deaths and all the rest of it that could be caused by a motor car, if you like. And it's similar sort of thing to drugs, I would say.
Yeah, with the motor car, because we like the motor car, we talk about how it's been useful to us, but with drugs, because we don't like drugs, we only ever talk about how they're bad, and not say how, for example, some hippie, like, taking acid has suddenly found enlightenment or whatever. Like, we don't talk about the good stuff, we talk about how it's dangerous and bad.
They completely disregard the pleasures. Although I don't necessarily know, I think maybe there could be a cultural shift sort of occurring in some sort of format anyway, because like if you look at, say, MAPS and like what they're doing, and it's actually been reported quite a lot in the Guardian as well recently, like the positive effects of, say, MDMA and like LSD, and how MDMA could be used now for therapeutic purposes, and how it has got this sort of, it could be beneficial for post-traumatic stress disorder and all this kind of stuff. So this is something that we haven't considered since the 60s. They thought about it in the 60s, and then that was it. They pushed that to the back of the mind. But we're starting to think about that again, and we're starting to have an academic inquiry into these sort of drugs and realise that, and look at the possible benefits and pleasures and everything now. It's not completely absent anymore. I think it is. I think the cultural shift is maybe starting to happen with that. I think
drugs like MDMA really exemplifies how the particular drug can move between these categories of non-drug, medical drug,
there's like a massive overlap, isn't there, between them?
And you get what we looked at with MDMA in the 60s. Like, people would, it was going to be for use for psychiatric medicine. LSD has all this talk about it being very good for fighting addiction and that sort of thing, and it's moved from being drugs that are useful for potential medicine to drugs which kill us, because they're used recreationally as well.
But the overlaps are still interesting though. If you look at that, I mean, heroin is a brilliant example of that. Like, that's probably one of the most demonised drugs that there actually is. However, diamorphine is used so widely within hospitals. Diamorphine, heroin, the same thing. But hospitals could not function without diamorphine. Put it that way. It's so constructed within that therapeutic context. We need it within that. But heroin is so demonised. So it's interesting. It's the lack of context that we currently have within drug policy and stuff. I think it hinders it.
Definitely. I think one of the interesting things that I'm trying to find it in my notes. One of the interesting things that I found drawn out of one of the papers was that this binary concept of drug use, which is okay if prescribed by a doctor, or if it's coffee or alcohol, where you suddenly seem to be able to take responsibility for your own actions. But if it's an illegal substance, an illicit substance, then it is drug abuse, and that is bad.
Yeah, like the Kenneth Tupper paper, he was quite good at this actually. He said that there's two dominant discourses that are always present when we're looking at drugs, and that's we either see drugs as pathogens or we see drugs as malvolent agents. There's two dominant metaphors of how we see it. So we either see them within sort of a sick context, you need drugs to sort of feel better, or we see them as drugs are bad. You're either sick or you're bad. Or both, potentially. Yeah. And I think you wanted to say about like Amy Winehouse is quite a good example of
I mean,
sort of,
I think that sort of way of thinking about drugs as either being something that we have for when we're sick, or drugs as being a plague, which is often used, or drugs as being evil, something that we need to have religion and superstition about. That has been internalised by a lot of people, a lot of drug users, and you find people like Amy Winehouse in her song "I Don't Want to Go to Rehab." She talks about being bad, and the fact that she's taken drugs is seen as being a moral transgression rather than just an individual choice about what to put in your own body and what experiences you want to have.
Definitely.
And to a certain extent, we see it more with maybe the drugs as related to being medicalised and pathologised, maybe, as when you look at people like Professor Nutt and Transform, the stuff that they're talking about, their ideas about regulation of drugs having to be mediated by doctors, by having prescribed drugs, and that being the way that we actually have a drug system. And another example would be the way that the medical cannabis community really taken on.
You can see that users in the reform movement, like you mentioned earlier themselves, they've sort of internalised these two dominant metaphors. You either see it as a pathogen or you see it as a malvolent agent. It's interesting how actual drug users themselves and people within the reform movement really have sort of internalised this, and so it constrains the way they too look at the issue, I think. I mean, there's a Facebook group set up with regards to like the cannabis medical community, and I've had a look at it, and it was quite interesting. One of the users on there was a Daily Mail article about another user who he sort of saw straight away as being bad, as being wrong, as he's giving it to the kids and all the rest of it, and he differentiated him from his friend who was using cannabis for medical purposes. Oh, it's okay for him to use it because he's sick, but this guy's bad. So he used both of those dominant frameworks, those dominant discourses, and that's I think we're very constrained in the way we look at the problem if we're just going to use the same sort of framework that prohibitionists utilise, really.
This moralism about drugs is really something that is actually really quite ingrained in society.
It is,
and that's one of the things that I think is one of our biggest stumbling blocks to meaningful reform, is getting over that.
Definitely, because I think like the problem with the reform movement really is that we're sort of trying to think ourselves out of the prohibitionist regime, but we're only using like the language and the conceptual tools that actually exist within it. So we're never going to sort of really have any sort of meaningful debate or really move out of it if we're only using the tools and the discourse and the language that the prohibitionist regime has sort of utilised.
I mean, to look at the way that we talk about addiction, for example, we talk about addiction as being a disease, which is quite a useful way in today's society of talking about things, because of people's healthcare needs. But actually, the addiction as disease way of explaining the world was actually invented before any sort of healthcare for drug users or people who are addicted to drugs were invented, and that goes into this idea of drugs as diseases, of drugs as pathogens. Like we've taken that idea that was already there and applied scientific knowledge to it, but actually we haven't actually really questioned whether the idea that existed before
correct.
Exactly. That's what we generally need to do, I think, with the entire drug war paradigm.
Definitely. I think that's sort of the main point that we're wanting to make out of this initial podcast, really. Like, sort of, don't just go along with the intuitive sense that all drug wars are based on. Like, really question it, really go underneath underneath it all, really. I think that's basically, you know, the main.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose for me it comes down to the way we talk about drugs, and really the way that the questions we ask shapes the environment around which drug policy is made. I mean, as I said earlier, the UN focuses very much on collecting statistical data, numbers, and it's trying to be objective, and it's but we don't really talk about the cultural meaning, the real human aspect of the war on drugs, and the reason why people do drugs in the first place. And you have to ask yourself, really, what do policymakers have to lose by asking these sorts of questions? And maybe if they asked these sorts of questions and started to explain the reason why people did drugs, then actually serious questions would be raised about the effectiveness of a punitive drug policy.
Yeah, and the actual drug war paradigm itself and the entire prohibitionist regime. You'd probably have to overhaul the whole thing once you actually really start asking questions about like the actual human context of it all and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So I think there's a very it makes sense, because asking these questions really really eats at the platform that prohibitionists are standing on, and there's a reason why the UN Office on Drugs and Crime aren't asking these questions. But maybe we are asking these questions as a movement, which is good. But really, this needs to be asked by everyone. And that's how we're going to have to take this forward, is asking these questions to get ourselves out of this framework.
Yeah, definitely. Just keep asking. I agree with that. Keep asking these questions. Keep unearthing, the actual concept of what a drug is. It's not natural. It's not. It wasn't always there. It's something that we've actually invented. It is socially constructed, and just always keep that in mind. Because otherwise, if we're operating within the same framework, trying to reform sort of the laws and everything, it's never going to work. We sort of need to move beyond the law, work beyond it. Think about the broad picture, I think. And I think we could probably end it there, to be honest. And if you wanted to read either of those articles or have a look at what we've, to have a look more in detail what we talked about, I'm going to post them up alongside the podcast, so it should be easy to get hold of. And before next week as well, we'll post about which next two articles we're going to look at for the next podcast. So if you've got any ideas or anything, just get in touch.
Hopefully you can read along with us. And I guess thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much for listening.
Goodbye.